A 16-year-old black girl boarded a plane alone for the first time. Right seat, right first-class ticket. Yet within minutes she was pulled from her seat under dozens of silent stares. Not because of any mistake, only because, in the eyes of a senior flight attendant, her skin color didn't belong in that seat. Early morning at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Atlanta. The city still slumbered beneath a soft mist, but the airport buzzed like a hive. Familiar sounds, the wheels of suitcases rolling across stone floors, steady boarding announcements echoing through the PA system, and the gentle drip of coffee from the bar in the corner, created a soundtrack to thousands of unfolding journeys. Ruby Price, 16 years old, the only daughter of William Price, chairman of Carter Aviation, stood still at the boarding gate. In her hand she tightly held a first-class ticket, her heart pounding, not from fear, but excitement. This was her first time flying alone. No bodyguards, no father, no personal assistant. Just Ruby, a teenager in a gray hoodie, worn sneakers, a small backpack, and a ticket many believed she didn't deserve. "Hi there. May I see your boarding pass?" a young flight attendant asked with a soft smile. Ruby handed it over. Everything was smooth. No one knew she was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the aviation industry. She wanted to be treated like an ordinary person. She wanted to see what the real world was like, without the rose-tinted lens of status. She entered the first-class cabin and chose the window seat. She placed her backpack under her feet, gently took her earbuds from her jacket collar, and prepared to enjoy the 2-hour flight to San Francisco, where she would attend a prestigious summer program for gifted students. The other passengers in first class were all adults, dressed in sleek suits, carrying genuine leather luggage, exuding expensive perfume, and wearing expressions of cold detachment. Ruby shrank into her seat, her delicate face calm, her wide eyes like a child entering the world of grown-ups, and then, "Excuse me, you're in the wrong seat." A cold, sharp voice came from above. Ruby looked up. In front of her stood Sophia Bennett, the chief flight attendant, her blonde hair gently curled, her gray blazer pressed to perfection, her expression stern, and her gaze thoroughly judgmental. "This is seat 1A, Ruby replied. "I believe this is correct." Sophia took Ruby's ticket and examined it under the cabin light. Her expression softened briefly. Yes, it was a valid first-class ticket. But instead of apologizing, she frowned. "I don't know where you got this ticket, but I'll need to verify it at the main gate. Please get up and move to the back while we confirm." In that moment, the entire first-class cabin fell into an eerie silence. A few middle-aged men glanced at Ruby, then looked away. A woman even curled her lip and muttered sarcastically, "These days, fake tickets are everywhere." Ruby stood motionless. She could have shouted, "I'm the daughter of the airline's chairman." But she didn't. She looked at Sophia, her gaze steady, laced with disappointment, then quietly picked up her backpack and left her seat like someone who didn't belong. No apology. No sympathetic glance. Only silent looks that said, "That skin color doesn't belong here." The economy cabin was nearly full. Ruby found an empty seat near the back and sat down without a word. She pulled out her phone and typed a message. "I was moved to economy." They said the ticket wasn't valid. The message was sent to her father, William Price. No one on the plane knew that he was in the executive wing of the same airline, preparing for a high-level shareholder meeting on HR strategy. Seconds later, a reply. "Who did this?" Ruby simply snapped a photo of Sophia from a distance. No comment, no complaints. 1 minute later, the final message. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." What would you do if your daughter were treated like this for no reason? Leave a comment below. And if you believe small injustices must be called out, don't forget to follow the channel for more stories like this. In a corner of the cabin, a young flight attendant, Olivia Reed, had witnessed the entire incident. She said nothing at the time since Sophia was her direct superior. But when she saw Ruby sitting quietly alone, Olivia gently approached and leaned down. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked, her voice sincere without pretense. Ruby nodded, but in her eyes was a small fracture, the first crack of growing up, of truth laid bare. Olivia seemed about to say more, but the internal radio buzzed. "Olivia, report to the front cabin immediately." Sophia's voice, urgent, ice cold. Olivia turned away, but her eyes lingered on Ruby. Inside her, a discomfort rose, a kind of injustice she had always ignored, telling herself, "It's none of my business." But this time was different. This time, something was about to erupt. What happens when the airline discovers the person they mistreated is the chairman's daughter? And will Ruby remain silent, or will someone speak out on her behalf? The executive operations suite of Carter Aviation was located on the 35th floor of the corporate headquarters, a space reserved exclusively for the company's most senior figures. That morning, as usual, large screens continuously displayed updated flight data, phones rang in steady rhythms, and staff in gray suits moved about like clockwork, gears turning with mechanical precision. William Price, a black man in his early 50s with piercing eyes and a calm demeanor, was in a closed-door meeting with regional directors, the Aviation Security Division, and the Strategic HR Board. He wore a plain white shirt, no tie, yet no one in the room dared interrupt when he spoke. Spread across the table were internal reform plans, including a full reassessment of frontline personnel after a series of complaints regarding covert discriminatory practices within the system. William was speaking about the importance of a bias-free service culture when his private phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A message from Ruby. Attached. A photo of a blonde woman in a chief flight attendant uniform. William was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood, picked up his phone, and walked out of the meeting without saying a word. The room fell into dead silence. Out in the hallway, William made a call. No assistant, no introduction needed. "This is William Price. Get me the head of operations for Flight 4082, ATL to SFO, immediately." His voice was calm, but it carried a cold undertone like steel. The person on the other end froze. "Yes, sir. We'll connect you right away." 3 minutes later, in the flight control office, 3 senior personnel were summoned. One of them was assigned to audit all data from Flight 4082, cabin cameras, internal comms, and the first-class passenger list. 10 minutes later, the name Ruby Price appeared, linked to the highest tier priority code, a chairman-issued internal VIP ticket. Back in the aircraft's front cabin, Sophia Bennett was still unaware of what was unfolding on the top floor of headquarters. She was complaining to the captain over the intercom. "We have a passenger with a first-class ticket, but not the appropriate conduct. I moved her to the economy. Must have been a mix-up by the coordinators." Meanwhile, Olivia Reed, the young flight attendant, quietly passed through the mid-cabin. In her hands were 2 bottles of water and a warm towel. She stopped by Ruby's seat and gently bent down. "You don't have to say anything. I just want you to know, sometimes things aren't right, and I saw that." Ruby didn't respond, but her hand, which had been tightly gripping her phone, slowly loosened, perhaps because for the first time she felt someone was on her side. Back in the operations room, William Price looked up at the control screen. He wasn't furious. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I want the entire flight crew on Flight 4082 held in place until I speak to them personally, and that flight will not land in San Francisco as scheduled." An executive director swallowed hard. "Sir, are you requesting a route change?" I want them to return to Atlanta immediately after takeoff, under internal safety authority. The room fell silent. A decision like that could enrage hundreds of passengers, cost millions of dollars, and shake the media. But no one dared object. William sighed. In his eyes was pain, not because Ruby had been treated that way, but because this was still so common. He had hoped the reforms would prevent such incidents from happening again. But this morning, when his daughter was humiliated out of her first-class seat, he understood. This battle had only just begun. Back in economy class, a boy about 10 years old sitting next to Ruby looked at her quietly and asked, "Miss, did you get sent here because you did something wrong?" Ruby gave a faint smile. "No, sweetie. I was just sitting in the seat that belonged to me." The boy frowned. The answer too complex for a child, yet painfully simple for adults who should know better. At the front of the plane, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a special technical directive, Flight 4082 will return to Atlanta Airport immediately after completing pre-takeoff checks. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." The entire cabin stirred in confusion. Sophia Bennett froze. She quickly turned on her intercom and asked the captain for clarification. The reply was brief. "Executive order." No further explanation. Sophia walked straight to the first-class cabin, her eyes filled with unease. She had never been interrupted like this before, especially when she thought she was simply following protocol. But what is protocol, and what is prejudice masked as protocol? Who will face William Price when the plane returns? And will Sophia have the courage to realize that her mistake touched something far beyond her job title? The skies above the state of Georgia were cloudless that morning. On the radar screen at Carter Aviation's Air Traffic Control Center of Flight 4082 was marked with a special green dot, indicating a flight carrying a top-secret priority passenger. Only the highest-ranking executives knew that on board was the daughter of Executive Vice President William Price, and the flight had just turned around mid-journey, cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. No public statements, no media announcements. Everything was unfolding in silence, but it was a silence heavy with warning. At headquarters, Emergency Operations Room. The security command door opened. Two men in black suits bearing the insignia of Internal Authority Oversight, an independent watchdog entity within Carter Aviation, entered the room. They were summoned directly by William Price to lead the investigation. William didn't wait for introductions. "Begin collecting footage from the cabin, all communications from the lead flight attendant, and the crew's internal logs. I want a preliminary report in 45 minutes. One of the men blinked in surprise. "Isn't the protocol 24 hours, Mr. Price?" Without looking up, William replied, "Not when the victim is my daughter, and not when this airline's integrity is being stained by ignorant prejudice." Aboard Flight 4082. The cabin was unusually quiet. The more observant passengers sensed something was off. An elderly woman whispered to her husband, "Did you notice how that attendant treated the black girl earlier?" "I saw it from the moment we boarded." Ruby Price sat still, gazing out the window. But within her a storm was rising, not because she had been demoted, not because of the disrespect, but because she knew, no matter how powerful her father was, this could still happen. To her, to anyone who looked like her. A few rows ahead, Sophia Bennett was trembling. No one scolded her. No one confronted her. But the silence around her was heavier than 1,000 accusations. Olivia, the young flight attendant, glanced at Sophia, then quietly rose. She pulled out a small packet of printed pages. It was the Internal Behavior Code Handbook. She placed it in front of Sophia and whispered, "I didn't do anything, but maybe you should read page 12 again." Sophia looked down. That page clearly stated the section on racial discrimination disguised as professional judgment, and at the bottom bold text read, "No one has the authority to define a passenger's worthiness except the internal verification system. Any seat downgrade made without a clear cause will be considered a breach of professional ethics." Sophia felt her hands go cold. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck. She still didn't know. The plane was turning around because of her. Back on the ground, Atlanta International Airport. As soon as Flight 4082 changed course, the airport's security division received an alert. Activate Level 3 Internal Response Protocol, a rare measure reserved only for severe threats to corporate reputation. A 3-person team in gray uniforms, the Brand Crisis Response Unit, arrived at Gate E21. None of them wore name badges. One of them was Margaret Liu, Carter Aviation's Director of Media Crisis Management, nicknamed the Fire Extinguisher. She didn't ask William Price any questions. She simply said, "I've prepared several media strategies, but I'll wait for your directive." William looked at her, exhaled slowly. "I don't want you to cover it up. I want the truth." A quiet moment, deepening emotional tension. At that same moment, in a quiet room at headquarters, Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly janitor, looked up at a small TV showing the weather forecast. She silently wiped down a framed photograph on the wall, an old image of William Price when he'd just taken office, standing beside his wife and young daughter in front of a model airplane. She gave a wistful smile, then murmured, "If only they knew Ruby once saved a little girl who got trapped in a plane lavatory last year. But now, just because of her skin color, they dared pull her from her seat." Her words echoed in the empty room like the quiet sigh of a history that no one had ever stopped to hear. When the plane touched down at Gate 21, security cameras were rolling continuously. Dozens of staff were in position, but no one made a sound. Everyone remained silent, just as instructed from the executive level. The aircraft door opened. Passengers slowly disembarked. No one knew what was going on, but the presence of numerous nameless personnel only heightened the tension. Finally, Ruby stepped out. She looked up and saw her father standing at the end of the corridor, his face stern, but his eyes full of protection. Ruby walked toward him. No one said a word. No words were needed. Moments later, Sophia Bennett was also asked to disembark. Standing before her were 4 unfamiliar faces and a single question. "Would you like to restate your full reasoning for reassigning passenger Ruby Price's seat?" Sophia opened her mouth, but no words came out. Will Sophia admit to her actions, or will she continue to hide behind silence? And what awaits Carter Aviation's executive board now that the truth is about to be exposed to the public? There were no sirens, no one screamed, but everyone could feel it. A storm was quietly taking shape. Carter Aviation was one of the largest airlines in the United States, but today inside internal hearing room number 5, on the 17th floor of the operations wing. There were no signs, no media presence, no audience. Just a long table, 6 chairs, a jug of filtered water, and 4 people sitting in a tension so thick it was almost unbearable. Sophia Bennett, the chief flight attendant, sat in the center, her back straight, but her eyes lost and drifting. Facing her were Margaret Liu, the director of Brand Crisis, and 2 representatives from Human Resources and the Equity Division, Carl and Donna, both of whom had handled past cases involving racial discrimination. To Sophia's left sat an in-house attorney, pen in hand, occasionally jotting down notes. And at the observation seat, saying nothing but, with a gaze that pierced through every detail, sat William Price. The questioning began. Donna: "We'll begin with an audio excerpt from Flight 4082. This captures your recommendation regarding passenger Ruby Price. Please listen." The recording played, I think the passenger in seat 2A doesn't quite match the profile for that class. She may have the wrong boarding pass. Then Ruby's calm response, I have an e-ticket. This is the boarding pass. And Sophia replied, we need to verify. The system may have made a mistake. Carl stopped the recording. The air in the room turned to ice. Carl. First question. Why didn't you verify the e-ticket on the spot using the system, but instead instructed the passenger to move first? Sophia swallowed. I felt she didn't seem familiar with first-class service. Her clothing, her demeanor. I acted on professional instinct. Donna responded coldly. Your instinct cannot be the basis for evaluating passengers, especially when it affects someone's rights, and especially when that passenger happens to be the daughter of the executive vice president. Sophia lowered her head, but still tried to defend herself. I didn't know who she was. Margaret Liu gently placed a file on the table. The cover read, Seat Downgrade Complaints, 2024. Chief Flight Attendant, Sophia Bennett. She opened it to the center. The room held its breath. 21 unexplained seat downgrades. 17 of those passengers were people of color. No one spoke. There was no need. Margaret continued. And of those 21 incidents, not one was attributed to a system error. Sophia's face turned pale. Her fist clenched on her lap. I didn't mean to. I was just following intuition. Sometimes passengers don't behave appropriately. William Price spoke for the first time. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut like steel. So, you're saying my daughter didn't behave appropriately? Because she's black? Or because you assumed someone like her couldn't possibly afford a first-class ticket? Sophia fell silent. Her eyes darted elsewhere. Tense silence, deepening internal conflict. No one moved. Time felt frozen. Outside the room, Ruby sat quietly in the hallway, waiting for the session to end. She looked up at a poster on the wall that read, Carter Aviation, we carry trust, not just passengers. Ruby smirked faintly. Do they know trust is more fragile than the wings of a plane? No one answered the question, but it would be the first gust of wind before a coming storm. Twist reveal. The truth uncovered by an insider. Just as the hearing seemed to be ending, Carl stood up and said, Apologies, but we've received an internal voice recording, a statement from another young flight attendant on the crew. It hasn't been published, but was submitted anonymously under whistleblower protections. He played the recording. Sophia said, Whenever I see black passengers in first class, I feel the need to double-check. They usually cause trouble or don't meet the standards. She also said, This airline needs elite passengers, not ones who make people uncomfortable. Sophia jumped up. That's not true. That was a joke. I didn't think they'd record that. Donna cut her off. The problem is, you thought that was normal. William Price turned to Carl, his voice low and clear. Suspend Ms. Bennett, effective immediately, and prepare a public apology, not just to my daughter, but to every person who's ever been humiliated by this kind of behavior. Will suspending Sophia be enough to calm the backlash, or is this just the tip of the iceberg? And what will happen when more victims begin to speak up? The airplane cabin sank into a heavy, suffocating silence after the unexpected shock. Sophia Bennett stood frozen in the aisle, her eyes lost, like someone whose mask of authority had just been violently ripped off after wearing it for too long. Her hands were stiff at her sides, fingers unconsciously curling inward, grasping at the last threads of control. But it was clear. The moment Ruby turned and walked calmly back to the front row, without a single word of blame, it was enough to strip Sophia bare in front of every passenger's gaze. The aircraft still glided smoothly through the clouds, but within Sophia there was a storm of chaos without a name. You just ended your career, Olivia Reed whispered as she passed by, her eyes flickering with both sympathy and warning. The words felt like a dagger to Sophia's chest, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Sophia swallowed hard. She was used to control, used to being admired by younger flight attendants as a role model, professional, decisive, and polished. But now, with one thoughtless action, one prejudiced instinct, she had shattered that image. In first class, Ruby sat back in her seat as silent as if nothing had happened. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't complain. But it was that very calm, composed, cold stillness in her eyes that made Sophia feel more breathless than any public scolding could have. Sophia tried to take a deep breath. She needed to regain clarity. What should I do now? What can I do to salvage this? In the cockpit, William Price, the most powerful man in this airline, had just ended a call with the executive board. He was not one to anger easily, but when his daughter was humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, he could not remain passive. His direct order to have Sophia held on board after landing said it all. Sophia knew that. But what disturbed her most wasn't the summons. It was the fear of facing herself. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "We'll begin our landing process in a few moments. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure your seats are upright." A familiar sound, a routine protocol, but this time it played like a soundtrack to a moment of reckoning, where Sophia Bennett was no longer the one coordinating the landing, but the one being judged. Ruby sat still, tilting her head slightly to peer out the window. The sky gradually opened to the sight of the city below, blinking lights signaling that this journey was about to end. But to her, this wasn't the destination. It was the beginning. A message from her father appeared on her phone screen. "Are you okay?" Ruby gave a soft smile. She typed back, "I'm fine. They're confused." Not long after, another message appeared. "Wait for me in the VIP lounge. I've asked them to escort you there after landing." Ruby closed her phone and kept her eyes on the sky through the window. She didn't want anyone to feel humiliated. But if someone needed a lesson to wake up, that someone was Sophia Bennett. When the wheels touched the ground, the cabin filled with gentle sighs of relief. The sensation of landing always brought a bit of comfort, like everything could start anew. But not for Sophia. Olivia Reed stood near the exit, giving Sophia a look full of meaning. "They're coming for you. You should be ready." "I don't need you to tell me that," Sophia replied curtly. But inside she was crumbling. She wished someone would tell her this was all a misunderstanding, that no one was waiting for her, that everything would return to normal. The aircraft door opened. The light from the tarmac flooded in like a cold gust, rousing everyone awake. A security officer stepped onto the plane, his face stern, walking directly toward Sophia. "Ms. Bennett?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "You are requested to remain on board. Please come with me." Every step she took down the aisle was a silent indictment. Passengers on both sides watched without speaking, but their eyes said more than words ever could. Some whispered. Others looked away, not from indifference, but from secondhand shame. As she passed through first class, she couldn't help but glance at Ruby. The girl was still seated, watching Sophia with a gaze like a mirror. No anger, no triumph, just a direct, unflinching look. Sophia turned away. Outside the aircraft, 2 men in suits were waiting. One was tall, gray-haired, wearing a name badge, Samuel Gray, Senior Operations Director. "Come with us," he said plainly. Sophia followed like a shadow. No questions, no resistance. The internal corridor led to a small conference room with frosted glass walls, a corporate airline logo on the plaque. The air inside was cold, as if the room were built for only one purpose: accountability. Sophia sat across from Samuel Gray. Before him was a thick folder, her name printed in bold on the cover. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "Because I mistreated a passenger," Sophia replied, her voice hoarse. "Not just mistreated, you discriminated, and you know it." There's nothing worse than hearing someone else say out loud the very truth you've tried hardest to deny. Sophia wanted to object, but her lips wouldn't part. "You didn't check the list. You didn't call the gate to verify. You saw a black girl in first class and assumed she didn't belong." Silence. "Have you ever checked the tickets of elderly white businessmen?" he asked. Sophia lowered her head. "Then why was today the exception?" No one spoke. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. And in that extended silence, something broke. Not Sophia's career, but the image of the person she once believed she was. The airplane continued gliding silently through thick layers of clouds, its engines humming steadily, like the heartbeat that was keeping the tension of an unfinished story alive. But in the first-class cabin, where Ruby now sat again with a more grounded posture, the air remained dense with silence. Not the calm, restful quiet of a premium flight, but the heavy, awkward stillness of guilt, unease, and silent observation. Ruby sat upright, her back gently resting against the leather seat, eyes looking straight ahead, refusing to bow her head. The same passengers who had witnessed her being removed from her seat now occasionally stole glances at her, some filled with guilt, others with shame. No one said a word, but Ruby knew that moment had awakened something in many of them. And what about Sophia Bennett? She stood frozen near the front galley, hands gripping a tray of drinks, her eyes vacant as though trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. Olivia Reed approached from behind, holding a stack of napkins and a small snack pack, her voice deliberately light as if nothing had happened. "Are you going to serve her the drink?" Olivia asked, her eyes fixed on Sophia's face. Sophia nodded, her movements rigid like a rusted machine. "I'll do it," she replied, swallowing hard. Olivia said nothing more, simply placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, giving a firm squeeze, either a reminder or a warning. Sophia inhaled deeply, straightened her tie, smoothed out the wrinkles in her uniform caused by rushed movements, and picked up a glass of lemon water. She walked toward Ruby. With every step, it felt like the eyes of the cabin were watching, not with words, but with the weight of unspoken questions. Ruby, staring at the screen in front of her, noticed someone standing nearby. She turned. It was Sophia. Their eyes met, one strangely calm, the other visibly shaken. "Miss Price," Sophia said, her voice hoarse and heavy, "would you like anything else?" Ruby glanced at the drink, then looked back at Sophia. "I'm not thirsty," she replied simply, then turned back to the screen. Sophia stood for a few seconds, as if about to say something, but didn't. She gently placed the glass on the tray table, so soft it felt like a silent plea for forgiveness, then walked away without another word. Meanwhile, at the front of the aircraft, Captain Andrew Clark had just completed a final exchange with ground control. He hung up the receiver, frowning. The last directive from William Price had been crystal clear. The next action is mandatory, not optional. Captain Clark exited the cockpit and headed straight to the crew galley. "Sophia," he called out, "we need to talk." Sophia turned, her eyes wide like a student about to face the disciplinary board. "Captain, I know this is serious. I thought she wasn't—" Clark raised his hand to cut her off. "Don't think. You were trained to verify, not to assume, and you didn't do that." Sophia dropped her gaze, murmuring an apology under her breath. But Clark had already turned away, leaving her alone with the verdict quietly descending upon her. In first class, Ruby was texting. A message had come from her father. "They're preparing for an emergency meeting. When you land, someone will escort you to the VIP lounge. Stay calm. Ruby replied, I'm not worried. I'm observing. The aircraft began its descent. The seatbelt sign lit up. But instead of the usual excitement at the end of a flight, the cabin felt heavier. Everyone knew something was waiting outside, especially for Sophia Bennett. An invisible sentence was already waiting for her. As the wheels touched the tarmac, the internal phone rang. Olivia looked at Sophia. It's him. Sophia walked over, picked up the phone. William Price's voice came through. Low, cold, not loud, but enough to make her heart thump hard. You will not disembark with the crew, he said bluntly. Security is waiting. You'll be escorted to a private conference room. Sophia stammered. Sir, I'm sorry. I don't want an apology over the phone. I want an explanation, in front of me, in front of my daughter. Click. The call ended. Sophia stood frozen, still holding the phone, face pale, legs unsteady. Olivia stood beside her, not mocking this time. She simply said, You're not walking away from this. The seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers stood, gathered their bags. But instead of rushing to the exit as usual, they moved slowly. Some glanced back at Sophia. Some shook their heads gently. Then 3 security officers in black uniforms boarded the plane. They didn't need to ask names. They walked directly to Sophia Bennett, whose hands were clasped tightly at her waist, a woman bracing for judgment. Miss Bennett, one officer said softly, please come with us. Ruby glanced forward. Her expression was unchanged. No anger, no satisfaction, only silence, like someone witnessing justice being restored step by step. Sophia was escorted off the aircraft. Every step she took felt like treading on the very years in which she once believed herself untouchable. In the jet bridge between the plane and the terminal, 2 men in dark suits waited. One of them was Samuel Gray, Director of Customer Service Operations. His face was unreadable. Miss Bennett, he said tersely, the meeting room is ready. The meeting had only 3 people. Sophia, exhausted and bewildered, Samuel, cold and professional, and William Price, powerful, composed, but with eyes that had not cooled from anger. Do you have anything to say? He asked. Sophia glanced at Ruby, who was seated beside her father, still calm, still collected. I'm sorry, Sophia began, her voice trembling. I was wrong not to verify first. I judged, and I... William Price didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He said just one sentence. Then prove that your apology isn't just to save your career. If you've read this far, you know this story is about more than just procedure. It's about an inner war. Do you think Sophia deserves a second chance? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget, if this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe to follow more stories about justice, dignity, and awakening. The air inside the meeting room had thickened. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that forces you to look inward. Sophia Bennett sat there, her posture straight, but her eyes were lowered, staring at the documents in front of her. Complaints from passengers she had never known about until now. Every line was like a blow to the professional illusion she had built, that she was fair, serious, and by the book. But now it was clear. Those very rules she trusted couldn't save her from the truth. She had made decisions based on bias, not duty. Ruby said nothing more. She simply observed. But within that silence was a strange weight, not gloating, but more like a challenge. What will you do with this? Sophia took a deep breath. I was wrong, not just once, and I didn't realize it until everything collapsed. William Price stared at Sophia. He had encountered many people in his career, employees with countless excuses. But he didn't see that in Sophia now. He saw someone just beginning to face herself. "I want to understand, truly understand," Sophia continued, "not just to be forgiven, but to change, from the root." William crossed his arms, still neither nodding nor rejecting. "Do you know what disappointed me the most, Miss Bennet?" His voice was low, not loud, but carried the quiet authority of a man who had led thousands. Sophia looked up, waiting. "Not that you removed my daughter from her first-class seat, but that you never once considered you might be wrong." That sentence cut like a blade, but Sophia didn't flinch. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I trusted my instincts, my experience too much, and that blinded me." Then Ruby spoke, for the first time in a long while. "Do you know what it feels like to have an entire cabin look at you like you're a fraud? Do you know the feeling of being forced to walk down that narrow aisle carrying the weight of suspicion, disdain, and indifference?" Sophia nodded slowly. "I do now, because I see that same image staring back at me in the mirror every time I think about what happened." Ruby tilted her head slightly. Her expression wasn't anger or sympathy. William Price cut in. "If you're truly serious about making this right, I'll give you one option." Sophia listened closely. "Not reinstatement, not a return to your former role. You'll undergo 3 months of retraining. In customer service, bias awareness, and professional ethics. And if, after that, you prove you've changed, I'll consider letting you return, in a lower position." Sophia didn't respond right away. She let the offer pass through her thoughts, through the pride that had long shielded her. She once thought she would fight tooth and nail to keep her rank. But now the only thing she wanted to preserve was her integrity. "I accept," Sophia said quietly but firmly. William Price nodded. Ruby didn't smile, didn't thank her, but in her eyes something softened, perhaps a trace of belief that people can change. Weeks later, Sophia walked into a training room at the airline's headquarters, no longer wearing her polished flight attendant uniform. She wore a simple blouse, carried a notebook, and held a cautious gaze. Unlike past sessions, where she had led the front of the room, this time she sat in the back, listening. The trainer, an Asian woman with a soft but sharp voice, spoke about being ignored by a flight attendant after requesting water 3 times, about a black man who had his first-class ticket checked twice on the same flight. Each story was like a needle, pricking the remnants of Sophia's old pride. She saw herself in those stories, not as the protagonist, but as the one who had caused harm. Several moments of the session fell into silence. Some trainees glanced at her, knowing why she was there. But Sophia didn't hide. She took notes, asked questions, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see it as retraining. She saw it as learning how to be human. At the end of the first session, the trainer posed an open-ended question. "When you see a passenger entering the first-class cabin, what's the first thing you think?" Sophia didn't answer aloud, but inside, she knew. If the answer involved skin color, clothing, or age, that was the moment to stop and start again, from the very first look. Will 3 months be enough to truly change someone from the inside out? And can society truly forgive when someone dares to confront their wrongdoing? The steady hum of the engine blended seamlessly with the racing thoughts in Ruby's mind. She sat quietly in her first-class seat, eyes fixed on the window, watching thick white clouds drift past as if carrying away the simmering anger within her. But deep down, the calm she wore was just a mask. She knew what was coming, and this time she wasn't the only one who did. At the front of the aircraft, Sophia Bennet leaned against the service cabinet. Her hand was lightly gripping the seat back. This flight was supposed to be just another ordinary day, but it had become the biggest test of her life. And not everyone passes a test of conscience. Sophia was being watched, not just by Ruby, but by every eye that had once silently watched her order Ruby out of her seat. Everything might have seemed corrected. An apology in front of the passengers, a return to the rightful seat. But Sophia had forgotten one thing. Trust can't be bought back with optics. It only returns when you truly admit your wrongdoing and act on it. In the cockpit, Captain Andrew Clark glanced at the screen in front of him. A notification from the operations team appeared. Mr. Price requests a flight update. Immediate compliance recommended. He sighed. This is far from over. He muttered as he returned his focus to the controls. Ruby leaned forward and picked up a glass of juice that had just been placed on her tray. Unlike the first time this drink wasn't delivered by Sophia, it was brought by Olivia Reed. Olivia's gaze was warm and sincere. No avoidance, no judgment. She bowed slightly as she placed the tray down and quietly said, "If you need anything, don't hesitate. Just call me." Ruby looked at her, nodded softly. "Thank you." Just 2 lines, but more powerful than 100 justifications. Olivia didn't explain. She didn't apologize on anyone's behalf. She simply showed, "I see you, and I respect you." At the front of the cabin, Sophia stood motionless. A tightness rose in her throat. For the first time in 10 years in the industry, she no longer felt secure in her role. Not because of the criticism, but because she no longer felt secure in who she was. When Olivia entered, their eyes met briefly. Olivia paused, stepped closer, and spoke quietly. "Do you have a minute?" Sophia nodded, knowing Olivia wouldn't let this slide. "I saw it all, Sophia." "Saw what?" Sophia tried to keep her voice composed. "The way you looked at that girl from the very beginning. You didn't have to say it. Your eyes said enough." Sophia remained silent. "It's not just Ruby, Sophia. How many people have you treated like that before?" That question hit like a splash of ice water. How many people had she judged based on appearance, clothing, skin color, or simply because they didn't look like they belonged in first class? "Did you know I was proud when I first got assigned to an international route with you?" Olivia looked her straight in the eyes. "But today I'm ashamed of you." Sophia pressed her lips together, feeling as though she was being stripped bare in front of a crowd. There were no layers left to hide behind. Every piece of professional pride she had held onto was falling away. Back in the cabin, Ruby carefully folded her headphones, placing them into her bag. A new message lit up on her phone from her father. "We land in 25 minutes. Wait for the escort." Ruby smiled faintly. She wasn't happy that Sophia was about to be punished. Not at all. What she felt was justice. Something so many others never get the chance to receive. In the cabin, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign rang out. Prepare for landing. But for people like Sophia Bennett, this wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a storm waiting on the ground. In the rear cabin, passengers adjusted their seats and stowed away their belongings. But a shared stillness lingered. Many had seen everything. Some stayed silent out of fear. Some out of discomfort. But after seeing Ruby's eyes, after hearing her calm but unwavering voice, they knew. They had been on the wrong side. Nathan Cole, the elderly businessman, still remember when Ruby had asked, "Why am I the only one being asked for my ticket?" He hadn't been able to answer, because he knew the reason, and that knowledge made him feel small. When the plane touched down, a wordless tightness clutched at Sophia's chest. She tried to stay calm, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. As the cabin door opened, 3 security officers boarded. No need to ask names. Everyone knew who they were there for. Ruby kept her eyes on the window. No triumphant smirk, no proud stare. just the peace of someone who had endured without needing to retaliate. Sophia slowly stood, nodding to the captain. As she stepped out, her eyes unintentionally met Ruby's, the girl who had taught her a lesson no training program ever could. And under the muted afternoon light of the airport, a quiet question echoed in Sophia's mind. Do I have the courage to change? Or will I keep being the kind of person I would never want to become? The skies over Chicago were a dull gray, as if foreshadowing a storm, not outside, but inside Sophia Bennett. She sat silently in the familiar Carter Aviation boardroom, but this time she wasn't there to roll out a new service plan or receive a long service award. This time she was the one who had to prove she deserved forgiveness. The complaint reports lay in front of her, cold and emotionless, as if they were indictments. Each line felt like a strike against the self-image she had built for years, of being fair, professional, and by the book. William Price leaned back in his chair. His voice was calm, but with the weight of authority. You know, there are lessons some people don't learn in a lifetime. The question is, do you want to learn or keep hiding? Sophia swallowed hard. There was no room left for deflection, no point hiding behind vague terms like misunderstanding or unforeseen situation. I used to think I understood this job, she said, that I knew how to handle situations. But I was wrong, Mr. Price. I was wrong. From the very moment I looked at Ruby and didn't see her as a human being. The statement made Ruby, seated across the table, tilt her head slightly. Not in judgment, more as if she were weighing the sincerity of the words. William gave no reaction, simply motioning for Sophia to continue. Sophia took a deep breath. I've started the training course, not just to tick a box, but because I need to understand how much damage I've done, without even realizing it. I sat next to an Asian man. He'd been asked 3 times to show his business class ticket. A young Latina girl said no flight attendant ever smiled back when she said hello. They spoke, and I sat in silence. Not because I didn't know this happens, but because I saw myself in every one of their stories. She turned to Ruby. For the first time, her gaze no longer shielded the wound she was carrying within herself. I made Ruby feel small, judged, and cast out from a place where she belonged. And the scariest part is, I didn't even realize I was doing it. I simply acted on prejudices that had seeped into my blood without ever being questioned. Ruby said nothing, but a shift in her eyes was noticeable. From guarded tension to genuine observation. So, what do you want now, Sophia? William asked plainly. I'm not asking to keep my old role. I'm asking to start over. I want to be someone different. Not just for this job, but because I don't want to be someone who keeps hurting people. The room sank into silence. Nothing but the ticking of the wall clock, marking time like a countdown on a final chance. William turned to his daughter. What do you think? Ruby didn't answer right away. She placed her hands on the table and looked directly at Sophia. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't being kicked out of a first-class seat. It was the way you looked at me and assumed I didn't belong. I didn't say anything then, but I never forgot that look. Sophia nodded quietly. No protest, no excuse. But I can see you're trying. You're not denying it. You're not blaming the system. And that's rare. She turned to her father. I think she deserves a chance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia felt a flicker of something warm enter her chest in the middle of the storm. Hope. But it wasn't mercy. It was a responsibility that would have to be proven through action, not words. William pressed a button on the internal line. I'll approve a reinstatement plan under special supervision. You'll return as junior crew. No privileges, no protection, 6 months. Then we'll reevaluate. Sophia stood and bowed deeply. I'm grateful for this chance, and I promise I won't waste it. CTA number 2. Seamless integration. Do you think Sophia deserves this second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in real change, hit like to help spread that message. When Sophia walked out of Carter Aviation's headquarters that day, she didn't feel relieved. On the contrary, she felt a new weight on her shoulders. But it was a different kind of weight. The weight of accountability. Each step she took wasn't the stride of a woman with 10 years of experience, but of someone starting again from zero. With a lesson etched deep in her heart. A question still echoed in her mind. How do you fix what you've done when the person you hurt still carries the wound? And that question would become her compass, guiding her through a new chapter where, for the first time in her life, Sophia Bennett would learn to listen instead of giving orders. 2 months after Sophia Bennett officially returned to work at the lowest position within Carter Aviation, something had changed, not just within her, but in the air around her. Conversations in the passenger cabin were no longer empty chatter about schedules or seat numbers. She had begun to listen. She had begun to ask. And more importantly, she had begun to see people, not just passengers. On the other side of the story, Ruby Price wasn't standing still either. After the incident, Ruby received dozens of interview invitations, formal apologies from the airline, and interest from the media. But instead of turning herself into a symbol of outrage, she chose to become a catalyst for change. With the support of her father, William Price, and the growing momentum of the online community, Ruby launched a groundbreaking program called Empathy Wings, a mandatory training initiative for all Carter Aviation staff. It didn't just teach crisis response or protocol. It taught unconscious bias awareness, emotional intelligence, and how to break free from mental shortcuts. At the launch event held in the company's operations center, Sophia was invited to speak, not because she was the face of the program, but because she was the first to admit fault, and then do something about it. Standing on a simple stage before hundreds of staff members and journalists, Sophia held the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. I am a flight attendant who once judged a young woman because of the color of her skin. I used to think I wasn't biased, until I became living proof of how wrong I was. The room went silent. I hurt her. But today I stand here because of her, not to retell my mistake, but to share my journey of redemption, a journey I believe each of us can begin, if we're willing to face the truth. There were a few more seconds of deep, resonant silence, and then applause. Not polite clapping, but the kind of applause that rises from the chest. The kind that acknowledges courage, the kind that honors a truth finally spoken in the right place at the right time. Down in the audience, Ruby watched Sophia. For the first time, there was no caution in her gaze, only a flicker of trust. Moral of the story and real-life lessons. 1. Never judge a person by appearance or unconscious bias. Chief Flight Attendant Sophia Bennett dismissed Ruby simply because of her skin color and modest clothing. She assumed Ruby didn't belong in first class. But the truth? Ruby was the daughter of a billionaire and a VIP guest of the airline. This reflects how unconscious bias runs deeper than we realize, and often it's the root of injustice and silent harm. You never truly know who someone is just by looking at them. What we see is never the whole story. 2. Real change doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with action. Sophia wasn't just disciplined. She voluntarily stepped down and started from the bottom again. Meanwhile, Ruby didn't use media attention to retaliate. Instead, she built a reform program inspired by her experience. Both women proved that forgiveness isn't earned through words, but through committed transformation. Justice isn't about punishing someone. It's about choosing to live differently after we fall short. 3. Ordinary people can create an extraordinary impact. Ruby was not a CEO or a politician. She was just a young woman, yet her quiet courage to stand her ground sparked a systemic reform across an entire airline. Her story shows that age, skin color, or status don't limit your power to create change. You don't need power to begin, just the courage to stop staying silent. 4. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the most powerful force. Throughout the incident, Ruby chose silence, not submission. Her calm, unwavering dignity silenced a plane full of people and made millions reflect. That quiet strength forced accountability and made the world reconsider how it treats those with less power. How we hold on to our dignity in the face of injustice will define how the world sees itself. 5. It's never too late to change. Even for those who've been wrong, Sophia did discriminate. But she owned up to it, chose to make amends, and started over. From a disgraced flight attendant, she became a symbol of redemption. Her journey proves that people can change, if they are humble enough to confront their flaws. Redemption doesn't come from the right apology. It comes from 1,000 right actions that follow. 6. We all have a role in building a fairer society, whether you're a flight attendant, a passenger, or just an observer. Every reaction, every question, every time we choose to stand on the side of what's right, creates ripples of change. A just society isn't built by one hero, but by many people choosing not to look away. We don't need one hero. We just need many who refuse to make peace with injustice.